Welcome to episode 4 of Lost in Transmission, a deeper dive into modern textual criticism. In this episode, we're going to begin with a history of the New Testament textual criticism, starting with sort of the second wave of church fathers, the Irenaeus, Origen era, through the 3rd and 4th century, and then up through the Reformation periods, and then through the later Middle Ages and up until the 18th, 19th century, right up until through the 20th century. This textbook that we're reading from, A Student's Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible by Paul D. Wagner, was published in 2006, so it is not aware of the coherent space genealogical method of the 21st century. So we're going to continue covering textual criticism through the 20th century with all of its history and methods and results using this textbook. And then once we've completed that, because textual criticism, the nuts and bolts of textual criticism is well established with the methods described so far, and that the coherent space genealogical method simply takes a lot of those methods and computerizes it, although the results tended to change the whole priority of how textual criticism is done. But we'll get to that later. So we're not just, in other words, we're just not going to start with the 21st century. We're going to build the foundation of textual criticism through history and how it's developed. And then the coherent space genealogical method of the 21st century is a watershed method that does in some ways turn textual criticism upside down, although it still draws upon its legacy. Okay, so we'll begin just iterating these textual critics. So, a brief history of New Testament textual criticism. This chapter describes the historical developments that gave rise to New Testament textual criticism beginning as early as Origen and continued to the modern eclectic texts of the New Testament, that we have today. At the beginning of church history, Christians could learn from eyewitnesses to Christ and the apostles and share the knowledge that they had accumulated. For example, the first wave of church fathers, the Papias and Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch and so on, they would have a pretty clear lineage to like John the Apostle. Like Polycarp and Papias, I believe, would have been disciples of John, or at least one generation removed Papias to Polycarp, or the other way around, I can't remember. Then Ignatius of Antioch would have been a disciple of Polycarp, I think. You check that yourself. However, as time went on, fewer and fewer of those eyewitnesses remained, and the need arose for these sacred traditions to be recorded to safeguard their accuracy. Few individuals could afford even a portion of Scripture, so they would have to go to their local churches to hear the reading of Scripture and its instruction. Several of Paul's letters exhort the churches to read his letters. 1 Corinthians 5:27, 1 Timothy 4:13, and even to pass them on to other churches. Colossians 4:16. This suggests that the letters were to be copied and sent to other churches. However, in time, errors would have crept into the text. Because of the New Testament manuscripts have been hand-copied by numerous skilled and unskilled people throughout the life of the text, no two agree exactly in every instance. Let's stop there for a second. Let me read that sentence again. Because the New Testament manuscripts have been hand-copied by numerous skilled and unskilled people throughout the life of the text, no two agree exactly in every instance. So there's no perfect copies, is what they're saying. Now, I don't know if he means that no extant manuscripts agree, or if this is just a principle that he's stating. And we won't get distracted by that. The process of New Testament textual criticism can be traced to copyists who, in an effort to improve the text being copied, made conscious choices about its preferable reading. And there's a footnote here from a book called Textual Criticism by Eldon J. Epp. Bruce Metzger says that Theodotus, a leather merchant who was excommunicated as a heretic by Pope Victor, this is about AD 187, was the first to use textual criticism. Back to the body of the text. It was these differences in the manuscripts that led scholars to realize the need for textual criticism. Multiple manuscripts could be compared across passages to determine the more plausible reading. Okay, so let's start with Irenaeus. This is Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons in France. While it is likely that textual criticism began earlier, one of the earliest recorded instances of New Testament textual criticism appears in the works of Irenaeus. In one example, Irenaeus, AD 140 to 202, preferred a particular reading of Revelation 3:18 because it was found in all the good or weighty ancient copies. So there you go. There is the principle of better manuscripts being stated by Irenaeus. Our next textual critic is Origen of Alexandria. Origen's biblical commentaries refer to the New Testament readings that were supported by few, many, or most of the biblical manuscripts available to him. Origen, AD 185 to 254, complained that the differences among the manuscripts of the Gospels have become great, either through the negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check over what they had transcribed, or in the process of checking, they were lengthen or shorten as they please. So what's a takeaway from this paragraph is Origen is speaking of readings that were supported by few, many, or most biblical manuscripts. So he seemed to have somewhat of an abundance of manuscripts. At the same time, he's complaining of the differences have become great. And we're talking about second, third century is what we're talking about. So by the 2nd and 3rd century, the differences have become great through negligence or the perverse audacity of others, the neglect to check over what they transcribed, and so on. And they seem to lengthen or shorten as they please, according to Origen. Jerome, 345 to 420, tediously sifted through numerous old Latin manuscripts when producing the Latin Vulgate, completed between AD 382 and 405. Eldon J. Epp explained the process Jerome used to choose between readings. Jerome, who took note of variant readings, considered an older manuscript to carry more weight than a recent one, and preferred readings that best suited a passage's grammar or context. Jerome even suggests that variant readings were possibly the result of confusion of similar letters, confusion of abbreviations, accidents involving dautography and haplography, the metathesis of letters, assimilation, transpositions, and deliberate emendations by scribes. Jerome lamented the great diversity of Latin manuscripts, stating that there are almost as many forms of texts as there are manuscripts. This seems to suggest that the Latin texts used by Jerome were already significantly corrupted. This is 4th century. Bruce Metzger describes Jerome's methodology. He used a relatively good Latin text as the basis of this revision and compared it with some old Greek manuscripts. He emphasizes that he treated the current Latin text as conservatively as possible and changed it only where the meaning was distorted. Back to the main body here, the paragraph. Jerome's comparison of manuscripts to determine the best reading of the text was textual criticism. Jerome's translation, the Latin Vulgate, reigned virtually unchallenged in Europe for over 1,000 years as the New Testament text. even though in time the Vulgate text incorporated copyist errors of its own. So let's remember this. Some people like to think that that we still have Jerome's Vulgate. We don't. I have it here in my logos package, the critical Vulgate. So they're doing textual criticism with the Vulgate, trying to restore the earliest version of the Vulgate. And so there is no Jerome's Vulgate. So it's a bit of a fairy tale to think that, oh, I'm going to read the Douay Bible because it's based on Jerome's Vulgate. Well, not really. Not really. Now we're making a big jump 1,000 years later to Erasmus of Rotterdam. During the Renaissance, Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466 to 1536, attempted at least limited textual criticism when preparing his edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516. Erasmus endeavored to complete this task as quickly as possible because another Greek text published in 1514 called the Complutensian Polyglot could not gain sanction from Pope Leo X. In 1522, both Old and New Testaments with Hebrew lexicon and grammar of the polyglot were published, and they subsequently received the sanction of the Pope. Erasmus had hoped to find reliable Greek manuscripts to prepare his Greek text, but the only manuscripts available on such short notice required significant correction before they could be sent to the printer. Metzger describes Erasmus' process of determining the text. Since Erasmus could not find a manuscript which contained the entire Greek Testament, he utilized several for various parts of the New Testament. For most of the text, he relied on two rather inferior manuscripts from a monastery library at Basel, one of the Gospels and one of the Acts and Epistles, both dating from about the 12th century. Erasmus compared them with two or three other the same books and entered occasional correction for the printer in the margins or between the lines of the Greek script. For the Book of Revelation, he had but one manuscript dating from the 12th century, which he had borrowed from his friend Reuchlin. Unfortunately, this manuscript lacked the final leaf, which had contained the last 6 verses of the book. Okay, we're done with the Metzger quote. For the last 6 verses of the Book of Revelation, and in several other places, Erasmus translated the Latin Vulgate back into Greek. When Erasmus compared manuscripts to choose between readings, he used some of the same principles, at least in elementary form, that were developed by later text critics. However, even Erasmus admitted later that his Greek text was precipitated rather than edited. So the reason Erasmus is important is because this work being referenced became known as the received text, or the Textus Receptus, and it became the Greek New Testament of those early English translations, most notably the King James Bible. And so that becomes interesting when we talk about some of the responses to textual criticism here in the 21st century. But we're not going to get into that yet. That will be one of the last slides in the presentation when we talk about responses to textual criticism. But let's say right now, though, that the sources that Erasmus had were inferior, and this is an inconvenient truth that undermines the superiority of the King James Bible held by those King James onlyist types. Although, interestingly enough, the received text does seem to agree with the Byzantine text. So it seems like we've gone full circle with the coherence-based genealogical method seems to be vindicating the Byzantine text. So we don't want to go too far with making any conclusions based on this textbook and other textbooks and Bruce Metzger and all of the textual critics through the 20th century, because the latest data turns textual criticism results on its head to a certain degree. So we don't want to overreact either. Brian Walton. The first to systematically collect variant readings of the Greek New Testament was London Polyglot Bible, 1655 to 1657 by Brian Walton, 1600 to 1661. This work contained Robert Estienne's Greek text from the 1550 edition, better known as the Stephanus Greek text, and recorded at the bottom of the page variant readings from Codex Alexandrinus. Eldon explains, Alexandrinus, which had come to light in 1627, was assigned the symbol A by Walton and was a major factor in the now increasing activity of collecting variant readings and displaying them in the critical editions of the Textus Receptus. In the sixth volume, Walton inserted an appendix prepared by Archbishop Usher of variant readings from 15 different sources. Other Greek texts. Other notable works followed that compiled variant readings from Greek manuscripts. In 1675, Dr. John Fell, 1625 to 1686, Dean of Christ Church and later Bishop of Oxford, edited a Greek New Testament based on Elzevir Brothers' Greek text of 1633. The Elzevir brothers published 7 editions between 1624 and 1678. In an apparatus, Fell claims to have compared it with 100 manuscripts and versions. Just 2 weeks before he died, John Mill, 1645 to 1707, a teaching fellow from Queen's College, Oxford, published his Greek text in which he collated evidence from manuscripts, early versions, and church fathers. He asserted that there were 30,000 variants in the few New Testament manuscripts he was familiar with. Epp summarizes Mill's work well. The sheer size of this body of variants raised disturbing questions about the validity of the Textus Receptus. Beyond that, in his Prolegomena and Textual notes, Mill enunciated several important text-critical principles, including the judgment that the more obscure a reading, the more authentic, and he implied that genealogical relationships may exist between manuscripts. For his achievements, Mill appropriately may be called the founder of modern textual criticism. Others also collated various manuscripts and added increasingly comprehensive critical apparatus to the Greek text in order to correct what became commonly known as the Textus Receptus. Johann Bengel. While a student at Tübingen, a German scholar named Johann Bengel, 1687 to 1752, was so disturbed by the 30,000 variants in the Greek manuscripts published by John Mill that he devoted himself to studying the transmission of the Greek text. He collected as many editions, manuscripts, and early versions as were available and carefully examined them. His work showed that there are far fewer variants than originally thought and that no variant affects any article of evangelical doctrine. Bengel was the first scholar to divide the manuscripts into groups and weigh them rather than assume they were of equal value. In 1734, he published a Greek text that closely followed the Textus Receptus, and the apparatus he classified relative value of each reading according to the following categories. A equal original reading with certainty. B equal a reading superior to the Textus Receptus, though with less than absolute certainty. Y equals a reading equally as good as the one in the text. Delta equals a reading not as good as the one in the text. And epsilon, an inferior reading that is to be rejected. Bengel explained the principles by which this apparatus was developed. One of his key principles was the difficult is to be preferred to the easy reading. This principle included several caveats and has since been further refined, but it remains a primary principle of textual criticism. Because his Greek text challenged the authority of the Textus Receptus, he was ostracized by some, even though he was known to be a very pious man. Johann Jakob Griesbach. From 1775 until his death, Johann Griesbach, 1745 to 1812, professor of New Testament at the University of Jena in Germany, traveled to England, Holland, and France to collate New Testament manuscripts. He also devoted much time to examining New Testament quotations in the writings of the Church Fathers. And he gave attention to several ancient versions that until the time had been little studied: the Gothic, Armenian, the Philogenian, Syriac versions. Metzger claims he laid the foundation for all subsequent work on the Greek text of the New Testament. Most New Testament textual critical scholars recognize the three recensions into which Griesbach divided the New Testament manuscripts: Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. So these are also known as text families. Some of the manuscripts of the Church Fathers that he placed into these three recensions are as follows. So under Alexandrian, then we have these symbols. So we're not getting into these symbols now, but I wanted to bring up these text families because text families played a big role in textual criticism beginning in the end of the 19th century, especially with Westcott and Hort and those first critical, widely known critical versions. Through the 20th century with Brutes Metzger and the Nessel Alan and United Bible Society works. However, the coherent space genealogical method has gotten rid of text families, except for the Byzantine texts. So there's going to be a big never mind towards the end of this. But for now, we'll see that these texts, especially the Alexandrian texts, would be any reading that an Alexandrian text held would trump any other reading. That is the 20th century paradigm that has become obsolete, which is very interesting. Griesbach elaborated 15 canons or guides for the New Testament textual criticism. The first reads, "The shorter reading, unless it lacks entirely the authority of the ancient and weighty witnesses, is to be preferred to the more verbose, for scribes were more prone to add than to omit." While Griesbach sometimes would rely too heavily on mechanical adherence to his system of recensions, by and large he was a careful and cautious scholar. He was also the first German scholar to abandon the Textus Receptus in favor of what he believed to be, by means of his principles, superior readings. So we can see this trend away from the Textus Receptus towards what we might call a critical version, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, the watershed edition was the Westcott and Hort edition, and that's where it really draws a line that now we're into critical Greek New Testament, and we're abandoning the received text. Karl Lachmann, 1793 to 1851, a professor of classical philology at Berlin, was the first scholar to publish a Greek New Testament based entirely on textual critical principles. Although he considered it impossible to reproduce the original text, his aim was to compile a text significantly earlier than the Textus Receptus. In his own words, "Down with the late text of the Textus Receptus and back to the text of the early 4th century church." Epp describes his method. His aim was to formulate the text as it had existed just prior to AD 400, and his bold method was to lay aside the entire established traditional text and to draw his own text from the oldest Greek uncials, the Old Latin and the Vulgate, and some early fathers such as Origen, Irenaeus, and Cyprian. Lachmann's Greek text indicated with brackets that had doubtful textual support and listed passages that differed from the Textus Receptus. However, his editions of the Greek New Testament in 1831, 1842 through 1850 fell short of reproducing the text of AD 380, partially due to his slender use of manuscript evidence. Nevertheless, his work turned New Testament criticism in a new direction, as Fenton J. A. Hort explains. A new period began in 1831, when for the first time a text was constructed directly from the ancient documents without intervention of any printed edition, and when the first systematic attempt was made to substitute scientific method for arbitrary choice in determination of the variant readings. In both respects, the editor, Lachmann, rejoiced to declare that he was carrying out the principles and unfulfilled intentions of Bentley as set forth in 1716 and 1720. Konstantin von Tischendorf, Modern New Testament textual critics probably owe the most to German Protestant theologian and textual scholar named Lobegat Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf, 1815 to 1874, who dedicated his life to preparing for publication as many manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament as possible. He actually produced 8 editions of the New Testament and nearly 24 New Testament manuscripts. In a letter to his fiancée, Tischendorf states, "I am confronted with a sacred task, the struggle to regain the original form of the New Testament." During his lifetime, he discovered and published more manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament than any other single scholar. He relentlessly searched the libraries of Europe and the Near East in search of the New Testament manuscripts. At the age of 25, he began the laborious task of deciphering the Palimpsest Codex Ephraimi. This manuscript of 5th century Greek text was reused by Ephraim, a Syriac church father. One of Tischendorf's most important finds was Codex Sinaiticus at St. Catherine's Monastery near the foot of what was believed to be Mount Sinai. Tischendorf explains the manuscripts, versions of the writings of church fathers available in his day. Even though these sources were a fraction of what is available today, his comprehensive and accurate work paved the way for those who follow. Yeah, and Codex Sinaiticus is one of the 2 most preeminent of the Alexandrian texts, and would trump any other version. It and Codex Vaticanus would trump any other reading through the 20th century, and that's why it's so important. So we're coming up against our 30-minute boundary, and so we'll pick up with Westcott and Hort, who are watershed figures in the next episode. And so we'll see you for the next episode. Thanks for your attention.